In 2003, the United States launched an unprovoked invasion of Iraq, destroyed that nation, and transformed it into a colony. Its proud professional army was disbanded. Its government institutions run by the Baath Party were dissolved, and assets of its national oil company were transferred to Western oil companies. President George W. Bush knew there were no nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons being produced in Iraq before the invasion, as did most congressmen and our corporate media. Bush accomplished a secret goal of returning control of Iraqi oil fields to Western oil companies. Zionists were pleased that another opponent to Greater Israel was eliminated, while the U.S. military and its allies in the military industry enjoyed another profitable war. This invasion was quick, with few American casualties, except for a hard bump in the road in the Iraqi city of Nasiriyah, where Iraqis fought back and caused chaos. Nasiriyah is a city on the road north to Baghdad. This 2003 battle was its second visit by a Western imperial power during the past century. In 1915, World War I was going badly for Britain. The Ottoman Empire was allied with Germany and possessed vast oil fields in Iraq. The British saw an opportunity to expand its empire by sending forces from its colonies in the Persian Gulf region into Iraq. After capturing nearby Basra, British troops boarded boats and sailed upriver to Nasiriyah. This led to a pivotal battle in the Mesopotamian campaign, as 5,000 British and Indian troops defeated the defending Turkish garrison of similar size. This was good news for the British public, and more troops were dispatched to continue the fight northward to conquer all of Iraq, which the British kept after the war. The 2003 American invasion of Iraq followed the same route, but could use excellent paved highways. Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein had done good things for the people of Iraq by spending oil wealth to improve Iraq rather than investing in Western corporations via New York banks. In 1980, neighboring Iran was in turmoil after its American puppet dictator was ousted in a revolution. Hussein was encouraged by the Americans to seize an oil-rich region of Iran. This led to a disastrous 8-year war that left Iraq bankrupt. Saddam Hussein was upset by the lack of support from nearby Sunni nations in his war against Shia Iran. Oil-rich Sunni Kuwait also bordered Iran and had refused any financial assistance. Iraqis disliked tiny, ultra-rich Kuwait, which the British had carved from Iraq to retain as a colony as its colonial forces withdrew from Iraq in 1961. Hussein decided to seize Kuwait after the Americans indicated they would not object. The Iraqi people cheered this invasion, but it was a trap. The United States military complex needed a villain after the end of the Cold War, and Saddam Hussein was chosen. See the short video linked in the description, The Dark Side of the 1991 Gulf War. After the Americans liberated Kuwait, some pundits criticized President Bush for not invading all of Iraq to remove evil Saddam. This decision was explained in 1992 by then Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney.
Why didn't we bury Saddam Hussein when we had the chance?
Well, that's a question that I'm frequently asked. Let me spend a minute on it, Ted, because it's an important subject. At the end of the war in the Gulf, when we made the decision to stop, we did so because we had achieved our military objectives. That is, when we decided to halt military operations. And those objectives were twofold: to liberate Kuwait, and secondly, to strip Saddam Hussein of his offensive military capability, of his capacity to threaten his neighbors, and we'd done that. There's no doubt in my mind but what we could have gone on to Baghdad and taken Baghdad, occupied the whole country. We had the 101st Airborne up on the Euphrates River Valley about halfway between Kuwait and Baghdad. And I don't think from a military perspective that it would have been an impossible task. Clearly it wouldn't, given the forces that we had there. But we made a very conscious decision not to proceed for several reasons, in part because as soon as you go to Baghdad to get Saddam Hussein, you have to recognize that you're undertaking a fairly complex operation. It's not the kind of situation where we could have pulled up in front of the presidential palace in Baghdad and said, "Come on, Saddam, you're going to the slammer." We would have had to run him to ground. A lot of places he could have gone to hide out or to resist. It would have required extensive military forces to achieve that. But let's assume for the moment that we would have been able to do it. We've got Saddam now, and maybe we put him down there in Miami with Noriega. Then the question comes, putting a government in place of the one you've just gotten rid of. You can't just sort of turn around and walk away. You've now accepted the responsibility for what happens in Iraq. What kind of government do you want us to create in place of the old Saddam Hussein government? You want a Sunni government or a Shia government? Or maybe it ought to be a Kurdish government? Or maybe one based on the Baath Party? Or maybe some combination of all of those? How long is that government likely to survive without U.S. military forces there to keep it propped up? If you get into the business of committing U.S. forces on the ground in Iraq to occupy the place, my guess is I'd probably still have people there today instead of...
After leaving office, Cheney became head of an oil services company where he was paid millions of dollars despite disastrous decisions that nearly bankrupted Halliburton. When he left to join the George W. Bush campaign as vice presidential nominee, he was paid $20 million in severance pay and had a different view about invading Iraq. See the short tale linked in the description, Stealing Oil from Iraq. Vice President Cheney organized a massive propaganda effort to deceive the American people by warning their lives were in danger by claiming Iraq was producing nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons. This was a lie, and the United Nations refused to support this aggression because UN weapons inspectors in Iraq had found no evidence. France threatened to veto any Security Council resolution to endorse an invasion, but President Bush ordered an invasion anyway. The United States military was ordered to invade Iraq and had been preparing since the 1991 Gulf War ended. The U.S. Army had built up massive stockpiles of equipment and munitions in nearby Kuwait. After the 9/11 terror attacks in 2001, plans were set in motion to invade Iraq, as explained in the great documentary linked in the description, War of Lies: How to Sell an Invasion. The Iraqi army had been decimated by years of sanctions, and its regular soldiers were not expected to fight, with the exception of Saddam Hussein's elite Republican Guard in Baghdad. The American military plan, misnamed Operation Iraqi Freedom, was to dash north to Baghdad, with the U.S. Army using one axis of advance and the U.S. Marine Corps another. The first few days of the invasion went well and became a race between U.S. Army and U.S. Marine Corps generals to prove who could advance faster. American unit commanders were encouraged to ignore possible threats to reach their objectives on time. The Marines planned to drive through part of the Iraqi city of Nasiriyah and hope for the best. They knew there were no armored or Republican Guard units in Nasiriyah. Most of the Iraqi 11th Infantry Division around Nasiriyah had already surrendered to the U.S. Army, leaving just small militiamen and armed Army deserters in the city. The advancing Marines had encountered no serious resistance, and none was expected in Nasiriyah. A problem arose on March 23rd when the rear element of a huge U.S. Army convoy fell behind. These soldiers were Patriot anti-aircraft system repairmen of the 507th Maintenance Company. There was no reason to send a large Patriot battery and its maintenance personnel from the 507th into Iraq, but they were assigned to the U.S. Army's 3rd Infantry Division, so followed it. Their soldiers had never even fired their weapons in Kuwait prior to the invasion and were not escorted by gun trucks that were considered essential during the Vietnam War. The captain in charge of the 507th misread a map and made a wrong turn to lead his 18 trucks with 33 soldiers into enemy-held Nasiriyah. They passed some Iraqi troops who just waved. Once deep inside the city, the captain realized his mistake and turned the convoy around. There were hundreds of Iraqi militiamen in the city armed with automatic rifles and rocket-propelled grenades, who gathered and attacked the unprotected convoy. The convoy sped onward, but only 16 soldiers and 8 vehicles escaped from the city. 10 vehicles were disabled or destroyed in Nasiriyah. 11 soldiers were killed, while 6 wounded were captured, and 10 soldiers continued fighting. The American Marines had huge M1 Abrams tanks leading their column to Nasiriyah to intimidate the locals to stay clear and peaceful. They soon arrived at Nasiriyah and were shocked to find wounded U.S. Army soldiers outside the city, who told them most of their unit was still in Nasiriyah and probably dead or captured. The Marines charged into the city, rescued 10 soldiers, and withdrew. Their tanks were out of fuel, since the M1 with a gas turbine engine guzzles fuel, so required hours to refuel. After 4 tanks were partially refueled, they led several lightly armored transport vehicles, called AAVs, full of a company of Marine infantry, into the city. Their objective was a key bridge north of town, but the direct route was a narrow road with buildings alongside and ideal for defense. So the plan was to drive around the eastern outskirts of Nasiriyah, but they drove into a large sewage disposal area, and all vehicles sunk 2 feet into the mire. Overhead power lines disrupted radio communications in the city, so they couldn't report their status. A second Marine company aboard AAVs followed, but became pinned down by enemy fire. A third company of Marines aboard AAVs arrived at Nasiriyah, but could make no radio contact with the 2 forward companies. It was assumed they had secured the narrow road ahead to the northern bridge, so they pressed straight into the city along that urban road with no tanks in the lead. These Marines encountered gunfire from all directions, but pushed onward to secure the bridge north of town that was their official objective. They were very lucky that militiamen in Nasiriyah were untrained and poorly equipped, and only 1 AAV was heavily damaged by a rocket. But the bridge was defended by some regular Iraqi troops with mortars, who opened fire and inflicted casualties. The Marines had no tank support, while the power lines blocked radio signals, so they couldn't report their location and struggled to call for artillery support. The Marines on vehicles stuck east of the city made contact with 2 U.S. Air Force A-10 attack aircraft that arrived and circled overhead to support them. Their pilots saw armored vehicles north of Nasiriyah and asked the stuck Marines if they were enemy troops. These Marines had no idea that a company from their rear area had just drove directly through Nasiriyah and reached the bridge, so they gave the okay for the A-10s to shoot them up. A dozen Marines were wounded by this friendly fire. The stunned Marines loaded their wounded on AAVs and drove them back through Nasiriyah to find medical care, but the A-10 saw them as an attacking enemy force, so strafed them again and destroyed 2 AAVs with missiles, killing and wounding many more Marines. This complex disaster is explained in the excellent, albeit simplified for television, documentary linked in the description called Shootout, Marines Battle in Iraq's Ambush Alley. 18 Marines were killed in this disaster, and a larger number were wounded, while 8 AAVs were destroyed, and an M1 tank fell into a canal, and its 4 Marine crewmen drowned. During the next 3 days, many more Marines arrived to secure Nasiriyah, while killing hundreds of Iraqis, mostly with air power and artillery. The Battle of Nasiriyah is correctly considered a Marine victory, but March 23rd produced the highest number of Marine Corps casualties during the entire invasion. There was no reason for the U.S. Army's 507th Maintenance Company to enter Iraq the first days of the war, and should have had gun truck escorts when traveling in an unsecure area. It was foolish to send Marine AAVs into the city without knowing the location of other Marine units, with no reconnaissance beforehand and no tank support. Baghdad was captured within 26 days as Saddam Hussein fled. It took the U.S. military many years, $1 trillion, and cost thousands of American lives to transform Iraq into an American colony. A few thousand American occupation troops remain there today at isolated bases. See the short tale linked in the description. Iraqis are unhappy with this colonial status, and minor attacks by militiamen are increasing as American warplanes occasionally bomb Iraq. A disaster much worse than the Battle of Nasiriyah may soon occur.